Good evening and welcome. My name is Nicole Watson and I'm the director of the Catherine G. Murphy Gallery. Let us begin by being mindful that we are gathered on land that is sacred to the Dakota people who have lived here for centuries and continue to live here. Thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture by Christina M. Spiker, our visiting assistant professor in art history and the curator of the gallery's current exhibition, Nostalgic Femininity, and its companion show in the library titled From Flowers to Warriors. Christina will spend about 45 to 50 minutes contextualizing the works in both of these shows tonight for you. And it's important to note that all of these works are things that are in St. Catherine University's archives and special collections. So we are so lucky to have these things here. I want to let you know, too, that Christina will take questions, but she'll take them at the end, since she'll be talking for kind of a long time. But that's okay. We're here for the history. I told Christina not to worry about the time. We're interested in the history, right? Afterward, I hope that you'll hang around for a little while and enjoy some light refreshments out in the lobby space. Before I turn it over to Christina, I want to tell you a little bit about her. She received her PhD in visual studies from the University of California, Irvine, with a specialization in modern Japanese art and visual culture. Her dissertation explored turn-of-the-century representations of the indigenous Ainu in Japan, and her research continues to investigate how their specific histories intersect with theories of globalization, modernity, and travel from the late 19th century until today. Since coming to St. Kate's, Christina's work has more consciously engaged with representations of gender in Japan, and she has both published and presented this work across the United States. For a more detailed list of her many scholarly accomplishments, I encourage you to take a look at her bio on the gallery's website. It is very, very impressive. I also want to point out that the work Christina did on our current exhibitions is truly a gift to St. Kate's. Prior to her research on these prints, we knew nothing of these significant works in our collections. We have a new understanding of their history, and they have been archivally framed and preserved thanks to a sponsorship Christina herself secured with Blick Art Materials. It feels like a huge understatement to say that we are very grateful to Christina for her scholarship and stewardship of these prints. So thank you again for coming tonight, and please join me in welcoming Christina Spiker.
All right, so good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm Christina, and my talk today is called, if I can figure this out, my talk today is called Nostalgia as Remedy, Modernity and Sentimentality in Japanese Woodblock Prints of the Meiji Era. And some of you may know art historians really love to read papers in front of large audiences. And tonight I'm going to try really hard not to do that. And the reason is because I want to have a conversation about these prints. I want you to get to know them, but I really also want you to get to know their history. I'm a firm believer that if you understand the history behind these prints, when you walk into the gallery space, you will see them with brand new eyes. The history really changes the way that we see them and the way that we look at them. So before we get into the Meiji period, however, we need to consider what came before. So even without knowing the name of this print, by a show of hands, how many of you have seen this before, know of this? Okay, most of the room, right? That was my hope. you all did not fail. So what you're looking at right now is Katsushika Hokusai's Great Wave off Kanagawa. And it's a print that is famous for its dynamic use of space, for the foamy white peaks atop churling waves, which mirrors the shape of Mount Fuji in the distance. Or maybe if you think about Japanese prints, instead you think about Ando Hiroshige, who was a famous printmaker and very popular amongst the Impressionist and the Post-Impressionist movements, one of Vincent van Gogh's favorites, for his innovative use of cropping and unique configurations of space. Or maybe yet, you think about Utagawa Kuniyoshi here on the left, as he portrayed virulent masculinity, complete with violent battles, criminals, villains, and heroes. Or instead, maybe you think about Utamaro and his beautiful women in small, intimate settings. The prints that I just showed you are all from the golden era of Japanese printmaking, known as the Edo period. So it ranges from about 1603 to 1868, when Japan was ruled by bushi, or warriors, headed by a military dictator called the shogun. When Americans think about Japanese art and Japanese visual culture, we tend to rely on these early print images of traditional Japan featuring battling samurai or geisha entertaining guests. These are the images we know best, the images we love, the images that collectors seek. But images such as this painting by artist Kawanabe Kyosai are just as much Japanese, even though they don't fit within a stereotypical image of Japan. My presentation today will hopefully help you unlock this particular painting, but by understanding Japan's modernization, I also think that it will breathe new life into the prints on view in both nostalgic femininity here in the gallery space, in addition to From Flowers to Warriors in the library space. So without further ado, our journey begins today in a period of time that we call the Meiji era. The dates that you see here, 1868 to 1912, correspond to the reign of the Meiji Emperor. Japan has always had an emperor, but the country was not always ruled by him. In fact, before Meiji, samurai rule had continued for a little under 700 years, with the emperor only serving as a figurehead at best or a puppet at worst. As an archipelago nation, Japan was able to maintain this form of rule and only engage with the outside world on its own terms. So we need to ask ourselves, what could have possibly changed to enable Emperor Meiji to come to power? And why does the art from the Meiji period look so much different from what came before? For me, the answer can really be summed up in this woodblock print of a black ship. The ship is given demon-like faces on the bow and stern, heaving with black smoke. Art historians believe that this artistic representation may show the USS Mississippi, a ship from the fleet of Commodore Matthew C. Perry, seen here on the left. And we have both a photograph, but also the Japanese representation of Petterdy. So, in 1854, 14 years before Emperor Meiji was restored to the throne, the Americans arrived in Japan under the orders of then-President Millard Fillmore. Perry was charged with the opening of Japanese borders to the west, and Perry was instructed to use gunboat diplomacy in order to do so. So if you look at this print, we not only have these demon-like faces, but we actually have cannon fire spraying horizontally, right, out from the ship. It gives you a little bit of an idea of how terrifying it must have been, right, to see these black ships coming into the harbor. So with the current shogun ill, the government was basically paralyzed at the end of the Edo or Tokugawa period. And Perry eventually succeeded in his mission, opening the ports of Hakodate and Shimoda to Western tourism and trade. And it was kind of interesting. He came, Japan sent him away. He went over to Taiwan for a little bit. They said come back in a year. He came back in 6 months. He was very persistent, but eventually, you weren't going to defend yourselves from these ships. So the ports did open, and Westerners really started to flood into these particular ports of trade. For those who held power in the Japanese government until this point, this turn of events was very frightening for them. A small group of men named shishi, or men of high purpose, decided that in order to resist the powers of the West and prevent Japan from being colonized, as was being seen throughout the rest of Asia and Africa in the 19th century, that they had to do something. They developed a catchphrase called Sono Joi, which means revere the emperor and expel the barbarians. And what they did is they overthrew the shogun. They were successful in their efforts, and in 1868, Emperor Meiji was positioned to claim the throne, heralding an era of what's called Bunmei Kaika, or civilization and enlightenment. So the idea behind all of this, right? If the Western powers are so strong, the only way to defeat them is to civilize yourself, right? To make yourself strong, or as strong, or if not stronger than them, to resist the impulse of colonization. And this was really the goal. So the goal wasn't so much we need imperial rule. The goal was we need somebody who will be more receptive to that, and the shogun was not, right? So returning now to this painting by Kawanabe Kyosai, we can see how Japan successfully embraced this call, modernizing the country quickly and efficiently. We see it in the architecture in the background here, featuring a site called Rokumeikan, or Deer Cry Hall, which was a very popular site for Western ballroom dancing and evening soirees. I hope you all noticed the gas lamps in the foreground here, which were brand new to Tokyo and Yokohama during this period. And it radically changed the landscape, having this kind of lighting on the streets. What I wanted to do is I actually wanted to bring in a couple of photographs of Meiji architecture just to set the stage of what Japan actually looked like during this time. Because the Japan that you see here is honestly not the Japan you're seeing in the prints in the gallery. And so I think through this contrast, you'll be able to develop a better understanding. So this is a photograph of a famous shopping street in Japan called Nihonbashi. Nihon means Japan, bashi means bridge. So there's a bridge that crosses this space. And this photograph was taken between 1900 and 1911, reproducing it from a photo album by Kazumasa Ogawa. And this is a halftone reproduction. And when we look at this is not, we're not seeing tea houses, we're not seeing Japanese castles, we're seeing telegraph wires, we're seeing streetcars. We have new modern architecture created with brick, which is one of the desired materials of the age. People are wearing Western fashion. This is Japan. This was Japan during the Meiji era, particularly by late Meiji. And this type of architecture was honestly embraced all over the country. So these are photographs that I took in 2013 when I was living in a region called Hokkaido, which is the northernmost island in the Japanese archipelago. Hokkaido at that time, the indigenous people called the Ainu had lived there, still live there today. And however, Japan had subscribed to this idea that Hokkaido was a blank slate ready for development. So the government went in and they built all sorts of new buildings in order to try to assert and craft this new modern city. So you're looking at the old government building here, which is a great example of architecture of the period. And that red brick you see is actually the nickname for the building. Everybody calls it akarenga, which means red brick, right? So it kind of gives you a sense of just how iconic this was. In Hokkaido, there is a historical village where they have relocated many of the historical buildings to a large open-air park. And so right here you're looking at the old Sapporo railway station that was built during the Meiji period. Just to give you a sense of what people were seeing. On the streets, you had horse-drawn carriages. What you're seeing behind here is actually a soba noodle shop. And if you look carefully, you can see that the building does retain a lot of Japanese characteristics, but do you notice that red brick, how it's integrated into the building itself? So when we think about Meiji architecture, we think about Meiji, it's really a period of hybridity. It's a period when all of these forces are coming together, and we haven't really left behind that traditional culture, but we're also moving forward into a new age. A hairdresser. I couldn't help myself, right? But just kind of look, we've got, siding, and these windows are amazing, and yet the building does still look Japanese. And so again, these hybrid forms of architecture. I brought in some interior shots as well. So we've got tatami mat on the floor, but then we're using Western style chairs in the same spaces, right? Just to give you a sense. We also have new lighting. It's another example of somebody's office. And this is from a residence that particularly prided themselves on their adherence to Western ideals, right? Here's another home. And I particularly love this because you have Western style bookshelves, but they're really, really short so that you can access them from the floor when you're sitting on tatami mat, right? So this is the world that people at the time are living in, the places that they're frequenting. This is what Japan looks like during this period in time. However, the truth is it wasn't just the architecture that changed. Newly imported Western fashions became all the rage with the upper class. And as art historian Norman Bryson has argued, women especially had to not only learn how to wear many of these new fashions, but they had to learn how to move in them. So as an example, Japanese women at the time before this were wearing kimono. And when you wear kimono or the summer clothing yukata, your legs are fairly close together and you have to take very short steps. So that, things stay together and that things are comfortable. But when you're wearing a ballroom gown and you are moving through the ballroom space, you have to stride and delicately move. You're not taking little tiny baby steps. And so women at this time, they had to retrain their bodies and they had to retrain their own movement so that they could wear these bustle dresses. And I think that's something really important to keep in mind, especially as we look at many of the nostalgic images on the wall, is that women at this time, their lives were radically changing, right? Men's fashion also changed, although I think they had the more comfortable lot. We often see top hats, we see waistcoats, leather shoes, canes, and Western style umbrellas, which look a lot different from a Japanese parasol. Print culture also begins to reflect these changes. But before I get there, I want to share with you a quote from a French naval officer. Pierre Loti was also a novelist, so he's an officer, a novelist, and he used to attend some of these evening balls at the Deer Cry Hall. And what he said in his novel is a bit too gilded, too bedizened, these innumerable Japanese gentlemen, ministers, admirals, officers, or officials in evening dress. And their tailcoats, already so unfashionable to us, how remarkably they wore them. Their shoulders were clearly simply not made for this sort of attire. It is impossible to say exactly how, but I found in all of them always strong resemblance to monkeys. And the women! Eligible young women on the benches or mothers ranged like tapestries along the walls, all more or less amazing to examine in detail. What was it in them that just didn't work? They were somehow strange. And I think this quote really gets to the heart of this tension of the Meiji era. So while Japan is working very hard to modernize, and I would say is very successful in that, at the same time, the Western perspective of what Japan was doing is that they could never be good enough. Right? They could never Westernize enough. When they wear the gowns, they wear them weirdly. These tailcoats are already out of fashion, and look how they fit their shoulders. Right? This is the kind of response that we see. This is not just a one-off quote. There's plenty of literature during this period that attests to this uncomfortability of French, American, British, German officers who are traveling to Japan and seeing the people wearing Western clothing. And many of them do compare them to primates. Sometimes they compare them to vermin. And at the same time, what's interesting is the women are eligible, right? This idea of availability of Japanese women is something that we often see in a lot of these texts. What's interesting, though, is domestically. So within Japan itself, artists and printmakers were also trying to grapple with these changes in fashion. So here I have a print by artist Yoshu Chikanobu, who is one of the artists I'll be focusing on. And he created a print called Western Clothing. So if you look at the top right, there's Japanese vertically. And if you can see those English characters, right? It looks like yu fuku. This is yofuku, and this means Western clothing, right? So the word Western clothing is written in Romanized Japanese. Kind of interesting. And what Chikanobu is doing here is he's really trying to grapple with these new fashions of the period, and he's not alone in this. There were many print artists that were really amazed by all of the new things happening at this time, and so they would make prints about it, you know. So there are prints like this. There are prints that talk about the new Western hairstyles, the new Western food, the new Western furniture. And so you could pick up these prints. Prints both in the Edo period and in the Meiji period were a cheap medium. I know we have them on the walls of the gallery. It makes them look incredibly special, but you could have bought them for about the cost of a bowl of noodles. So they were very, very cheap at the time. And we can think about these as like advertisements, right? Advertising new dress, advertising new fashion. We also see changes in the emperor. So I have photographs here by Uchida Kuichi depicting Mutsuhito, who is the Meiji emperor. And what we tend to see in the early Meiji period is a radical transformation of Mutsuhito's body. You can see him very young over here. This is the traditional clothing of the shogun. They had been wearing this type of clothing for, again, a little under 700 years. In fact, the emperor today still retains this kind of regalia. But you can see that the desired look for Emperor Meiji moves away from this and moves towards that. Most official portraits of Meiji have Western-style military garb, a very typical like Napoleon hat, and this is often how he is pictured. So this is his official portrait, and this portrait was given to painters to then paint. So you painted the photograph. Kind of interesting. So his body itself was radically transformed. His wife, Empress Shoken, a little bit less so in the early periods, but she doesn't stay in traditional garb for long. So, over in the library space, we have a show called From Flowers to Warriors, and this is one of the prints that is featured over there. And you can see how Emperor Meiji and his wife, Empress Shoken, are translated into this print. So Meiji with all of the military garb, and here you can even see the sword he's holding between his two hands, pointed to the floor. So he is embracing modernity here. He's showing his modern self, whereas Empress Shoken here is the bearer of tradition. This was very common in early prints of Meiji and Shoken. He would be the modern one, she would be the traditional one, and even in Japan today, very often women are seen as the bearers of tradition. So they are the ones that will make traditional food. They are responsible for upholding these kinds of things in the household. So you do see these very traditional gender binaries at play when we see prints like this. But as time went on, Empress Shoken actually revolutionizes herself, and we see her more and more wearing Western style dress. In fact, she went to a finishing school where she learned to be a gentlewoman, and she received a certificate in learning how to dress in a Western style. So not learning how to make clothing, but learning how to wear clothing, right? And she was really seen as a fashionista of her time. People were very inspired by her. They tried to copy her fashion. These are two of her dresses here that she had worn. You can get a sense, you know, they're not joking in these prints. They really are this elaborate with this much frill. Okay, these are original dresses. And what we see with later prints of Emperor Meiji and Empress Shoken is that eventually both of them are depicted in more Western style clothing. And here they are with their son, Prince Saharu. And what's so interesting about this print is, so in the foreground, the whole family looks extremely modern, at least in terms of Meiji standards. But if you look at the background here, a lot of this is harkening back to earlier trends within Japanese painting, particularly ink painting. So there is a little bit of this blending of tradition and modernity in this particular print. Shoken was known as a philanthropist, and here she is visiting a field hospital in Hiroshima, and she is the one in purple, and it's kind of interesting. She goes in her bustle dress, you know, to visit all of these patients in the hospital. We see a lot of prints of her activity like this, and this becomes kind of the image we see most often, her within this purple dress. Here's another print by Yoshu Chikanobu. And you can see the emperor and his wife is on the right of this print, kind of looking on over the scene. And she's in her purple dress next to her husband here. You know this is the imperial family because if you look carefully, let's see if this works. This symbol right here is a Paulonia. It's a type of plant, and this is the symbol of the imperial family. So there's some symbology working here, but this woman is kind of going out on an evening stroll through the garden. And prints like this were meant to show off dress, to show off the new modern fashions. Okay. What's interesting is that printmaking at the time was also extended to images of war. And whereas when you think about war in Japan, a lot of people conjure images of samurai on horseback, riding into battle wielding their katana, But the truth is, this is the kind of war print that we see in modern Japan. So the two prints I'm showing you are from the Sino-Japanese War. And what was happening during this period, so just like Japan thought it had to modernize like the Western nations, they also thought that they had to conquer others like the Western nations if they wanted to be taken seriously. And so Japan wages war against both China and Russia. They're successful in both accounts. And so the Sino-Japanese War, we're talking 1901, 1902, Russo-Japanese War, 1904, 1905. So Japan feels really good about solidifying its hold over the region. In addition to waging war, Japan also decided it needed its own colonies because you can't be a modern power without being an imperial power. So Japan starts colonizing its neighbors. It colonizes Hokkaido to the north, colonizes Korea, Taiwan, right? And so it's really trying to spread its influence, and printmaking was one medium that we used in order to spread the word. And they're dynamic, and they're amazing. When we look at prints like this, we have an explosion going off, and just the linearity of it is really interesting to see. But look at all of the stray bullets, flying through this image. And these stories of heroism, wartime heroism, as Onoguchi Tokuji kind of looks back at us in this print as he's dodged a bullet, right? We also see prints that are less action-packed, but a little bit more in terms of showing Japan as a modern military power. And so here you have an image of the Sino-Japanese War, officers on a boat, and they're deliberating their next strategy. These types of images are really common to what we see in the West in terms of images of the general lording over a map, things like that. So a lot of commonality. Japan's taking a cue from those Western images and creating prints demonstrating them. So all of that was to say, this is what Japan looked like between 1868 and 1912. This is Japan of the Meiji era, a time of radical transformation, a time that was both liberating and confusing to many people. And the person that I want to showcase and talk to you about for the rest of this time is a particular artist named Yoshu Chikanobu, who lived from 1838 to 1912. And the years of his birth and death are pretty significant from my perspective because he lived during the Edo period. He lived during that traditional period. That's when he was born. And he died the same year that Emperor Meiji died. And so his life and his work really stretches across these two historical periods. And what I want to focus on particularly is the role of nostalgia in his work. So a little bit about Yoshu Chikanobu as an artist. He never supported the changes in the Meiji period because he was the son of samurai. He was the son of a feudal lord that had a lot of power and a lot of land. And so when the shishi, those men of high purpose, were trying to restore the emperor, the artist Yoshu Chikanobu was firmly against it. He did not support this, and he actively spoke out against it. However, like most things in history, when the emperor was restored, when these changes started to happen, he really had a choice. Do I continue making art? Do I go into hiding? What do I do? And what he did, honestly, is he created both prints that we associate with modern Japan, and he created another body of work that really looked to the past, somewhat longingly. So this print I had showed you before, but this is an example of one of his more modern prints. We see the bustle dress, we see the gas lamp in the garden. These are things that people are looking for when they're trying to find these images of modern Japan. It also has the use of synthetic red dye called aniline red that was newly imported during this period. Everything from the technology used to make it to the content really emblematizes these changes in Japan that Chikanobu himself was quite unhappy with. What we know about Chikanobu's work is while most of his work featured women, he did create a few prints of men. We have one album of men that looks back to the Edo period. These are all men that lived within the Chiyoda Outer Palace. So here you have people going to the shogun, bowing down to the shogun. I brought in one more of a hunting scene. Really beautiful, right? So Chikanobu, again, he's looking back. His male prints were actually far less successful than his female prints. And a lot of the way that we read and understand his work is through the way he represents the female body. So this is one of the prints over in the gallery here, and you can see that very conspicuous use of red in this print. That, again, it's these synthetic dyes. But when you look at the overall content of the print, there's nothing about this that screams modern Japan. It doesn't even scream transitional Japan, right? It really is a look back, and so there's a little bit of a play on seasons here. So the idea is if it's spring-colored garden in snow, you have all of these spring flowers inside the interior space, but the windows are open to the winter garden outside. And this is a mark, again, of traditional Japanese architecture, which is built from wood and paper, and so often you could remove these doors to create a seamless transition between interior and exterior space. So we're seeing that happening. These are all women enjoying each other's company. This is really what he's known most for, is women in other women's company. And you can see here, you've got these peonies, not only in the folding screen in the back that features peonies and pheasants, but also, integrated into the carpet, into the women's kimono itself. This is kind of classic Chikanobu to me. And when I first saw these prints with my own eyes, after a graduate student named Heather Carroll introduced them to me, this was the very first print that I unfurled. And the minute I saw this, I knew this was a Meiji print, but I was really confused because I knew it was a Meiji print because of the color, but I couldn't figure out what Chikanobu was trying to do here, why he was looking to the past in such a way. And what I started to realize is that the bulk of the prints that we have in the collection feature this sort of nostalgic longing for the past. And so this print here, Scattering Gold in the Flourishing Pleasure Quarter, Tamagiku and Kinokuniya Bunzaemon, is really kind of this sentimentality for brothel culture. And so in the middle, you have a very wealthy merchant, Kinokuniya. If you go to California or Japan today, the Kinokuniya bookstore, that's this family, right? And, courtesan Tamagiku is the woman off on the right side here. We can tell she's a courtesan based on her hairstyle, all of these elaborate pins in her hair, in addition to the fact that her obi, or the sash tying her kimono, is tied in the front. If you are a sex worker, you tie your obi in the front so you can retie it yourself, right? And what's happening in this scene, it's so lively, but Kinokuniya has all the money and he's throwing the money, he's making it rain. And all of these other courtesans, including their children, are fighting over each other trying to get this money. And there's a kind of joy in this print. There's a kind of, again, a longing for a time when things were different. I love the people in the background that are peeking out to see what happens as if they're about to join the scene. And as the viewer, we're kind of brought in, through the triptych format, the way we see them. I love this kid down here with the foot in the face. I can't help it. This neon green you're seeing here is another synthetic dye from the Meiji period. So again, it's one of these things, this red, this green, it looks almost unnatural. And I can't tell you how often I've been in my office and heard people walking around the gallery and say, I've never seen a Japanese print with these colors before. And that's why, the content conforms to what we might expect from earlier periods, maybe Utamaro's beautiful women, but the colors are very surreal to us and they don't fade because they are synthetic. So they're incredibly bright. Chikanobu also created prints that deals with women's relationship to shogunal authorities. And here we have two courtesans arriving for an official hearing. Now, there's not a lot of information. The title of the series and the print is in the top right, but there's not a lot of information in terms of what's going on here. So we don't know if this woman is being charged with something or whether she's here to offer testimony. We really have no idea. But Chikanobu here is using a lot of traditional techniques, and I really encourage you to look closely at this print in the gallery, because when you look at her kimono, the crane that you see there, the entire crane's body is embossed, and you can see the raised textures in that bird's wings. Also, the wave on her kimono is also augmented with silver mica. So in certain angles, you can see those waves shining, almost like the Great Wave off Kanagawa and the way that that moves. So the fabric and textile of kimono becomes its own canvas in a sense, in order to incorporate these symbols and this natural imagery that we've seen in prints of the past. I always think that this particular retainer looks a bit schmarmy, this guy. He's got his hands folded, and he doesn't look like he's going to be very kind to this woman, although we don't quite know what's going on. But I encourage you, with a lot of the prints in the gallery, if you turn to a slight angle, you can really see that kind of embossing and those kind of designs. So in addition to documenting concubine and brothel culture, Chikanobu is also known for his depictions of court women. And so these are women that would have been at the shogunal court. And you can see them here. It's a beautiful seasonal print, but this is all spring. So these are cherry blossoms above the women. And even today, picnicking amongst cherry blossoms is a very popular pastime come April and May. We know that these women are part of the Tokugawa shogunate because of their umbrella. If you look at the symbols on top, we have, again, the symbols of the shogun. So we know who they belong to. We know their relationship. It situates them firmly in the past for us when we see symbols like that, because it no longer exists at the time when the prints are made. So this is 1894. To think about that, this is the very end of the 19th century. So by this point, telegraph wires are being put in, you have steam trains, and this is the type of print Chikanobu is making. So he's making bustle dresses on the one hand, and then on the other he's making these. Here's one more, again, a very traditional print. Everyone always asks me what those things are that are marching about. These are gigantic floats with rice cakes, mock-ups of rice cakes for the new year. And what's also interesting about these prints, not only do they look back, but they look at women in terms of their generational relationship. And so here you have 3 older women and you have 2 younger girls, and you can see that there's kind of this transmission of culture between them. Again, their kimono is serving as a canvas. You see those waves reappear once more here. And the people in the background, they're all dancing and celebrating this new year. So there's a man with a lobster on his head, and a lobster is a traditional symbol of longevity. And you have a man who's wearing a mask of a mythical creature called a tengu on his face. So again, they're all dancing, merriment, and the women are kind of watching from a balcony. They're important women because they're part of the court. And so this idea that this was a time, when you could celebrate these kinds of things. And you look at this street, and the idea is that streets in Japan do no longer look like this. So Chikanobu's really reaching back here. He's thinking about a time when he was still alive, but things were quite different. One thing that a lot of people don't realize when they walk through the gallery is that a lot of the prints on view are contemporaneous with photography. And we can do a lot of comparisons between the prints and photographs that are created during similar time periods. So this is a photograph by Kazumasa Ogawa. This is the same person that did that halftone reproduction of Nihonbashi, the shopping street. And it's a woman playing a shamisen. And photographs at this time, they were created through an albumin process, and they were often painted on top of the actual photograph. This is something very unique to Japan and early Japanese photography, the hand painting. And what's interesting is a lot of people who formerly helped in the print process, when they needed work, they would go and help with the hand coloring of photographs. So there was a little bit of movement between the world of photography and the world of printmaking. But what we tend to see is that the images that are created in photographs are of the traditional world that no longer exists. And these are photographs intended to be sold to foreigners. So they were assembled into albums for people to buy as they were touring Japan. So here's another image. And actually, in this case, the photograph predates the print by quite a bit, right? And so you can see it would be silly to think that these things are created in a vacuum. There's a lot of borrowing of imagery between photography and printmaking during this time. And so you can look, this idea of the woman in winter dress. This was a very popular theme that we tend to see. And I think that's a particularly beautiful photograph exemplifying it. But, again, it's a kind of a little bit of a cliche that we see in wintertime. Just to give you one more example, another very popular theme was tea ceremony. So this is a print not by Yoshichika Nobu, this is by Yosai Nobukazu, but you can see this attention to tea ceremony of attending to generations between women, again, transmitting culture from older women to younger women because they are the ones that will carry it forward, right? So we tend to see images like this. So Westerners are coming and they're buying these photographs. And what also starts to happen is that Westerners are coming and then they start buying the prints. And the prints were really popular souvenirs at the time, again, because they were cheap. They were never sold for a lot of money and people could amass them quite quickly. But what Westerners were picking up were not the images of women in bustle dresses. They were not picking up prints of brick buildings. They were not picking up prints of velvet, upholstered furniture. They were picking up prints like this. And while we don't know how the prints in the archives and special collections got there, I have some theories, but I don't know concretely. One idea that I have is, well, if an American were in Japan buying prints, what kinds of prints would they buy? They wouldn't buy, even though I think they're kind of amazing, to see all of this new fashion of the time, they wouldn't have bought those. They would have bought the images that conform to our stereotypes of Japan. And this is part of the reason that even today, people that are not very well informed about Japan do have a lot of stereotypes about who the Japanese are, what they look like, what their lifestyle is like. And a lot of it comes from visual culture and what was transmitted here. I want to close on one example. So many of you that have been over to the exhibition, you've noticed that there is a vitrine with a very small crepe paper book inside. And I want to close on this crepe paper book just to think a little bit about these new Western audiences, because that crepe paper book was never made for a Japanese audience. In fact, when I was presenting in Yokohama this past November, I learned that there is not a single copy of this book in Japan left. All of the copies are here in the United States or in Germany. So printmaking for such a long time was intended for a domestic audience, domestic Japanese audience. But what starts to happen as we start entering into the 20th century is that printmaking, people start to realize that Westerners like it a lot, and they start using it for that purpose, to sell. So the smiling book, you can already see the English right on the front of it, right? That's your audience, is a very small, quaint book. And it's made out of Japanese crepe paper. And a lot of people ask me, how do you do this? How do you create crepe paper? And what I'll say, is originally this print is the same size as any of the prints you see on the wall. And they print it first and they crepe it second. And what they do is they dampen the paper, they wrap it around a dowel, and they pat it down, and they keep doing this in different directions until the paper gets crinkled and until it shrinks. So a person, Hasegawa Takejiro, was a real entrepreneur. He was a book publisher, and he started to think that maybe we could market books like this to women and children in the United States and in Great Britain. And he thinks that crepe paper is really going to appeal to this population. And so he patents this process. And what's so interesting, you know, when you see the smiling book, and you can see Hasegawa's name down here, it's a little bit faded, but he writes his name in English, is that this image of Japan is kind of moving away from nostalgia, almost just into cliche, right? We've got a man, what we might consider coolie labor, drawing a rickshaw with a Japanese woman. Of course, you have Mount Fuji in the background because you have to. And on the right there, if you look, you can see just the edges of a torii gate, and this signifies a Shinto shrine, right? So it's a religious site. So he's pulling her away from this religious site that she probably has just visited. And images like this were repeated all over Japan. And this is what I mean when I say it starts to be, it's a little bit more cliche than nostalgia here. What I'm showing you are lacquered albums, and these were for photographs in those treaty ports. So like the shamisen player, the tea ceremony that I showed you, these are the types of albums that would contain those photographs. So when Hasegawa commissioned this book from an artist named Suzuki Kason, what he insisted is that it copy this look, this very particular look, because this is what Westerners want. They want traditional Japan, right? So we can really see the overlap here, you know, even down to the fact that there's an umbrella, right? I mean, just, it's kind of amazing. And what's interesting about the book is that there's very little Japanese in the book itself. Most of what you see is English poetry. And so this poem here was written by a female author named Helen Leavenworth Herrick, and she writes, "Cherry blossom, lithe and little, almond eyes and dusky hair, in her garden waits and listen, she's a musume, sweet and fair. Safe at anchor in the harbor, rides the ship from northern shores, while the small boat hastens gladly with a lover at the oars." Right? And so musume here, it's a word that it means daughter, but it's often referred to like young women, right? But she spells it very differently than we might expect, right? Again, it's the kind of poem. It was originally published inside of a journal, a literary journal that Hasegawa got his hands on from many of the missionary wives living in Tokyo at the time. We also have Shakespeare. Because, you know, right? All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. And here we have Japanese men and women. Again, a very traditional image, down to the Buddhist monk who has his back turned to us. And so this idea, right, that you could commodify this sort of traditional culture. And what was so interesting, and interesting to me still, is that this was gobbled up by travelers to Japan. These were very popular. Hasegawa made his living on these crepe paper books. And so, again, Vincent van Gogh had crepe paper books in his collection that we know. You know, these are things that were highly collected. And yet the Japan that we see is actually not the Japan that was existing at that time. However, they participated in that new modern economy. So that was enabled by the opening of ports. So it's an interesting confluence of a variety of factors here. Okay. So just some closing remarks. While artists and printmakers had no choice but to move forward with the new technologies as they produced work in a Japan that was rapidly changing, people living outside of Japan became rampant consumers of traditional imagery. Today, it helps us understand how artists like Chikanobu led such a bifurcated existence. I was always questioning how he could simultaneously produce prints that looked back as well as looked forward. In my own reading of Chikanobu's work, I see nostalgia operating as a remedy. He returns to it throughout his body of work as a response to the dizzying changes around him. And yet even his traditional prints of women in kimono performing traditional activities were modern in both technique and style. And I think for him, these changes were truly unavoidable. So I'll leave it at that. I'm very happy to take questions, and thank you all for coming.
Questions for Christina?
Yeah, go ahead.
Doubtless there were these changes going on, but how much of the Japanese population do you think was taking part in this at that time?
Taking part in those changes?
Yeah.
So I think what we tend to see is that the changes were primarily focused on the metropole. So a lot of the cities, so you're talking Yokohama, Tokyo, Hakodate, Kyoto, Nagasaki, right? And many of the cities are the ones that are notorious for also being ports of entry to the West. So how do I put it? Not only could you trade, but you could easily get these objects. However, what I will say is that the Westernization project was actually a national project by the Japanese government. And so what the government was doing is bringing over Western professionals in a variety of fields to help them change their own institutions. So for example, when Japan wanted to colonize Hokkaido and the indigenous people living north, they brought over Americans who helped settle the American West. And they said, you were so successful at putting down Native Americans. Can you come over here and show us how to do it well, right? And so they did, and they took them away from their subsistence living on salmon, and they moved them away from rivers, and they forced them into an agricultural lifestyle. They did this with art museums. They brought over painters, and they brought over architects, and they said, build me an art museum and show me how to do it. And then they would take the painters and say, okay, now teach everybody how to paint with oil painting, right? And so on the one hand, yes, it's concentrated in the cities, but the truth is it really was a national project. And so I do think that that impacted the entire country. Because that was on the level of policy. We often don't think about art museums as being like national policy, but in this case it really was, because how could you be a modern nation and not have an art museum, right? And so a lot of the things that you saw here, a lot of the buildings I showed you, there was often a foreign architect that was a consultant in the production of those buildings. And so I think the visual landscape started to look different. And what starts to happen as a result of that is that you have people who start embracing folk culture in more rural areas. And so people are so upset about these changes, and they start saying, we need to find the real Japan. Let me go to these small villages where they create pottery, and let's kind of study this, right? And so you have a whole rise of what we call the study of Mingei, or folk culture at that time. And I think that is largely the reaction against a lot of this, but it's trying to find those spaces that you're referring to, the spaces where it hasn't really touched yet. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that it was such a national effort.
Yeah.
With the railroad coming in and all that. But I guess what I was thinking was that the people in Tokyo and the people in those situations, the wealthy people, were no longer dressing like the people up at the top.
No.
But there were still people, a lot of people, who were wearing that sort of clothes, not fancy ones.
Absolutely, especially, and a lot of what we're seeing are class divisions, you know, when we're looking at that. And so, you know, I think that that's certainly the case. But I think when we look at print culture widely, prints as well are circulating in the cities. Prints are not necessarily a medium that are being produced in the rural area because you need to sell them in the cities. And so I think that's why, in terms of what we see in prints, it is a reflection of this. I think if prints were being made elsewhere, it probably wouldn't. And what happens in printmaking by the time you hit the 1950s is that artists are doing every part of the process themselves, and they are returning to those areas, and they are producing prints in rural areas on their own, right? And they're showing Buddhist temples and things like that, right? So I do think that even within printmaking, you have that reaction. But a lot of the prints themselves, at least at this early period in time, you know, they're being sold in the cities as well. So they tend to reflect what we see in the city. But you're right, that doesn't encompass the whole of Japan. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
I really like your idea of your theme about nostalgia. I think that's really true and good. I also see from the point of view of foreigners coming to Japan that what they're craving is what was new and exotic, was first encountered.
Yeah.
And it's quickly becoming just like home. And so of course you start looking for what was unique to this place, that I never saw in, Podunk, Kansas.
Yeah.
And, so I can see why the market was there for that kind of work.
And I think also, you think about Pierre Loti, that naval officer, right, and his comments, there's kind of this disgust, with they're trying to look too Western. But I think you're right. There's this desire for exoticism and this wanting to experience that which you can't experience at home. And so I've been working on a travelogue by a British writer named Isabella Lucy Bird. And what's so interesting about her story is she goes into these towns and she'll be like, I didn't spend much time in Tokyo because it was too much like the beaten track and I had to get off the beaten track. So where does she go? Hokkaido, to meet the indigenous people there, right? But there's this, again, this seeking, like, where can I find the untouched Japan? Like, where can I find it? And that's what the travelers want. And these are the images they're buying. They're not buying these images down here. So when we look at collections, Japanese collections by and large have these. American and European collections have these. And so they've really moved around the world, but where they've landed tells us a lot about who is buying them. Yeah, but that's exactly what they want, right? Is to locate that culture, and prove to people that you saw it with your own eyes, right? Because again, there was a lot of literature before people physically started coming, and those are the scenes they wanted to find. They wanted to find the lone monk at the Buddhist temple and see the authenticity, of all of this. But the truth is, at least, especially at the port of entry, you walked into there and you looked at the street, and it did look a lot like home. Yeah. Yeah, of course.
You had mentioned when we talked earlier that, and this may have, in some way, have something to do with the fact that these prints were not terribly expensive, is that they were really produced by teams.
Yeah.
That the artist drew the plan and probably supervised the process, but you had teams of people cutting the blocks, teams of people inking the blocks, and producing these.
Yeah.
And as you said, in editions of like 100.
Absolutely. And that's something I really didn't get into in this talk. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to talk about it. I actually would encourage all of you, if you haven't already, a student of mine, Nicole Wallen, who's here, wrote a great essay in our small catalog that talks a lot about this process of printing. And she actually goes through all of the pieces of labor that are involved in doing this. But these were humongous teams. You had a printer, you had a block cutter, you had an inker, you had the publisher. They often had to go through censors. There are many people involved. And in fact, every print you see here, it took between 10 and 24 blocks of wood in order to create each one. So it was a very labor-intensive process, but you don't put all of that labor in and create one print. You put that labor in and you create 100 prints, and then if that print sells and is successful, then you create 100 more, and you keep doing that. And so what we're looking at here, these really are popular culture. I think printmaking in Japan has really been rehabilitated within art history, but for a really long time, these were not considered art in Japan. You did not study these if you studied art history. You studied ink painting on silk or on paper, And so I think this is something that's really changed as we see more popular visual culture being included within art history, is that we really have to account for printmaking and not only the process, but the consumption of them, because they were so popular. I mean, most of the ones I've showed you are triptychs. You all see that, right? There's 3 prints in a row. Sometimes triptychs were released at one time, but very often they weren't. The printer would release one, and then the next month you had to go back and then buy the second one. And then the next month would come and you had to buy the third one. And it was a way to really think about like serialization, or us buying magazines or having a subscription to a magazine. It's like, we want the next issue. And so they marketed that to their advantage. So yeah, but I really encourage all of you to read Nicole's essay. It's really wonderfully written and gets a lot deeper into this process than what I've just said now. Yeah. Any other questions?
Christina, I'm wondering, I already know the answer to this, but everyone else would like to hear it. Can you tell us a little bit about what your theory is about how these prints came to the collection?
Sure. So I have searched far and wide. I've dug pretty far into the archives and special collections in terms of any documentation that exists regarding these prints. In the old card catalogs, they just had these cards that kind of misidentified them. So for example, I would be looking at a man standing in a park with cherry blossoms fluttering around him, and all the card would say would have the wrong artist on it, and then it would say man standing in snow, right? And so I think there was an attempt by the, archivists of the past to kind of look at this and identify what they were seeing, but they didn't have that knowledge to know what they actually, what was in front of them. So my one theory that I have is that these could have been a gift by Sister Ermina Callahan, who was a sister of Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, and went over to Japan in order to establish a school. And so she was over there for a really long time. She came back here for about a 4-year stretch before returning to Japan again. And actually the dolls that you see on display in the gallery, those were all a gift from her in 1985. Now I know they're from her because we have the packing slip, right? So we know that for sure. Unfortunately, with the prints, I've been through development and everything, and I still don't have a concrete answer, but I do think that these were a collection. I think that somebody collected these together because the themes are so consistent and the time period is so consistent and many of the artists are consistent. Even many of them are from the same series. And so I do think somebody amassed these together. I don't think they came in like one at a time, right? And it could have been a sister. It also could have been a donor. And if anyone has information, we would love to hear your theories as we try to track this down. Yeah. Any other questions?
When was the sister there? She sent it in 1985?
So she sent the dolls to us in 1985. Yeah.
When do you think these might have been acquired?
I think they were in that drawer since the CDC, the Coeur de Catherine, was built.
Which is
30 years ago?
what was that?
Not quite that long.
Not quite that long ago? Anyone know when the CDC was built? I'm pretty new to St. Kate still, so I'm still learning my history.
I feel like it was maybe 15 years ago. It wasn't
15?
when I graduated.
The cabinet that they were in, when Heather Carroll, the graduate student that found them, they hadn't been moved from there since they were put in there. It was very clear that at some point somebody did try to archive them. About half of them were inside plastic. The other half were tightly rolled up, which is a real shame. So when you look at some of the prints in the frames, you can see some horizontal folding and striation. Those are the ones that have been rolled. Once they were put in that cabinet, they were kind of stuck in there. Beyond that, I don't have a lot of information. I know that those original catalog cards were produced in the 1980s. But again, I haven't found that piece of evidence that concretely links Sister Ermina Callahan and the prints, and that's what I would really need. I mean, I think it's possible, right? But I need that piece before I can concretely say that. Yeah.
Carol, you said that Sister Ermina and those people went over and nuns from the 4 provinces went there to establish that school in 57, isn't that what you
57.
said?
So that's the thing. And 57, the dolls were sent to us in 1985, right? So, I think it's a very high possibility. These prints would have been cheap even if bought in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, because it's only in the last 20 years that people have really started to care about Meiji prints. For a very long time, they were considered too modern to be worth anything. And so my bet is if it were her or if it was somebody else, they got these at a bargain at that period in time. They were not expensive at that time, and they would have been affordable. So, that's another thing, some people have said it couldn't have been a sister. They would have been too expensive. And I'm like, not at that time. At that time, it's very possible. So I would love to find that missing piece of information that allows me to say that with confidence. Yeah.
And I know when the sisters were in different countries, either because they were actually stationed there doing work or they were just traveling, they were really encouraged and given funds to purchase things that they normally wouldn't have but it was considered to be of value to bring them back.
Yeah. We have several silk paintings on silk and paper, hand scrolls in the collection. We have, I mean, honestly, all sorts of objects that we know came back. And I do have a couple prints that I know were hanging in bedrooms over in Carondelet. So there was an interest, and there was an interest in Japan too. St. Kate's used to have a sister school over there, Junshin Women's University in Nagasaki. Now, yeah, right?
I got that program going.
See, there you go. So, I mean, so there used to be a really strong relationship, right? And so I think, you know, again, it's really worth continuing to dig to try to figure out what was the context that allowed us to get this really great treasure. You know, what I could do is to try to give you information on the Japan side of this, what these things are, try to get them preserved, right? But hopefully, you know, in the future, more people will come forward with information that allows us to make these links. You know, some people have thought that it could have been a gift from the university, and you know, university gifts are often accompanied by a certificate with official seals and things like that, and we don't have anything, and I don't think that would have been thrown away. So that leads me to think maybe not that. But yeah, so I'm still sorting through the. Actually, that's been a lot of fun. Is hearing from everybody about what could have happened here. You know, I think for me, you know, the thing was, you know, do you wait till you have that, or do you put together a show and try to show off what we have? And I decided the latter. You know, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Christina.
You're welcome.
She was the archivist for a long time.
And her sister was
Yeah.